in the early parts of organizing our conference when it was obviously overwhelmed by the horrific things that were to come that at the time we couldn't have even envisioned. Now, the good news is that even through all of this, the ACJS continued to reach out and promote the field of Canadian Jewish Studies through its online presence, through live events, through recorded talks, and we're delighted to know that it was such a popular, or these were such popular initiatives. And so this year we find ourselves again gathered together, albeit virtually, to see and hear one another, to once again learn about our respective areas of research and see what is really stimulating us this year. Now, as you all know, hopefully, this year the conference is titled A View of the Field, Reflecting on Canadian Jewish Studies. And given the unusual nature of this past year, what we have decided, and obviously of this conference itself, what we decided to do is to sort of use this as a moment to reflect on the present and on the past, but certainly also on the future of the field of Canadian Jewish Studies, to see what is most interesting, what is stimulating the scholars in the field to promote their own work, and to push forward. So over the next 3 days, we have a diversity of panels. We have a number of people that will be joining us to present their ideas, and we're delighted to see this, to see so many of you get up on a Sunday morning to hear me ramble and introduce the conference, and then for the sessions to begin in earnest on what is traditionally our community days. So if you have the ability to do so and the stamina to do so, you can stay with us all day. If you don't, you can come back in when you feel like, just join, exit, go for a sandwich, whatever you got to do, hang out with your kids, and then join us again. And we'll have all sorts of things leading up to the presentation of the Rosenberg Award to Frank Bialystok this evening, and then also a session devoted to choral singing in both the past and the present. So we're really happy to see you all here. I would like to just take one more moment of your time before we move on into the panel properly to spotlight a couple of things. Number one, I failed to say who I was. So for those of you who know me, it's easy. You'll think, oh, it's this guy again. All right. For those that don't know me, you'll say, why is this guy, this schmuck, the guy who's speaking first? My name's Hernan Tesler-Mabé, as you see on your screens. And I'm the president. I have been the president of the association for the last year and will continue to do so, hopefully, for the next year or two. So I'm welcoming you warmly in that respect, but also I wanted to say this before I forget. I'm going to mention it probably 10 times because my memory is so short. That this conference could not have come together without the help of a great many, but particularly our conference chair, Jesse Toufexis, who is there and giving the thumbs up, and also Theodora Draper, who is our tech person / everything helping person, and has really helped put this all together. So thank you to you both. Thank you to those who are joining us to listen. Thank you also to those of us who are joining to present their papers, who are chairing, who will be part of the different panels. And I really hope that we can all treat this as the next 3 days as an opportunity to learn, to grow, to enjoy our field, to reflect on our field. And if you have any questions about the ACJS or about how our programming is going or about the sessions, please feel free to reach out to myself, to Jesse, or anybody else, and we'd be glad to help you along. I trust that you all have the copy of the program. for the next couple of days. And without further ado, I just want to say one last thing, which is to say thank you again for joining us for this. Enjoy the next 3 days, and I'll see and speak to as many of you as possible over the next 72 hours or so. Without further ado at all, I turn it over to Jesse, who is chairing this session, our first session, and to our speakers. And thank you very much, and enjoy. Thank you.
Thanks, Hernan. Hi, everyone. I'm Jesse Toufexis. I'm the conference chair, and I'll also be the chair for this session. So as Hernan said, welcome to the 2021 ACJS conference. I'm so happy to see everybody. After we had to cancel last year, very unfortunate. One of the few upsides of the global situation is that we get to have people who wouldn't normally be able to make it out to Ottawa or Toronto or Montreal, wherever we would have been. So I'm happy to see everybody. We have people coming in from Israel, from Australia, from the States. So I'm really excited about just that aspect of this, even though it does suck that we're not together. So once again, without further ado, let's get started with session 1, Canadian Jewish community concerns. So before I introduce the speakers, I'll just explain how this will go generally. And this will be the same for every session at the conference. So each speaker has a maximum of 20 minutes to present their paper. As the chair, I'll send them notifications privately in the chat when they have 10 minutes left, 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute, and when the time is up. While the speakers present, as the audience, you can send me questions in the chat that I will ask after every speaker is done. So after every speaker is gone, we'll spend the rest of the session in a question period. I'll ask the questions that I receive in the chat. And if you didn't have a chance to send me a question in the chat, you can virtually raise your hand through Zoom, and you can ask your question. Our tech person, Theodora, will unmute whoever I call upon. I'll ask myself, please remember that question period is for questions, not comments. So please keep your questions short, ideally 30 seconds or less. So that the spotlight remains on the speakers, and so that everyone has a chance to ask their questions. And I'll be fairly strict about this. And then the last thing that I'll mention before we get to the speakers, this is the first time that we're doing an online conference. And so this is also the first time that some of our speakers are doing an online presentation. So let's cut ourselves and each other some slack. There's gonna be some hiccups along the way, hopefully not too many. And yeah, let's have some fun. So here are our speakers. Our first speaker will be Valentina Gaddi from Université de Montréal. Her topic, or her paper title, is Études Juives Canadiennes et Genre, le point sur la situation, or in English, Canadian Jewish Studies and Gender, where are we at? So Valentina Gaddi is a doctoral student in sociology at Université de Montréal, and IRTG diversity scholar. She obtained a master's in sociology at the Université de Montréal with a dissertation on the controversies about Hasidim in Outremont. Her current research adopts an ethnographic approach to explore the construction of gender among Jewish Hasidic women in Montreal. More broadly, Valentina is interested in religious pluralism and the place of religion in contemporary society. She's currently the coordinator of the Collectif Judaïté at Université de Montréal. Our second speaker is Jonathan Slater from SUNY Plattsburgh. So Near Yet So Far is the title of his paper, with the subtitle, An Assessment of the 2018 Survey of Jews in Canada. Jonathan Slater is the founding director of the Jewish Studies program at SUNY Plattsburgh, where he also leads the campus's Institute for Ethics in Public Life and chairs the Department of Journalism and Public Relations. His research interests include the influence of mass media in the American Jewish experience, especially the role of radio in the first half of the 20th century. And our final speaker in this panel is Joshua Tapper from Stanford University, and the title of his paper is Crisis Leadership and Community Upheaval, Findings from Toronto Jewry at the Coronavirus Pandemic, an Oral History Project. Joshua Tapper is a doctoral candidate in Jewish history at Stanford University. His dissertation examines the revival of Jewish organizational and cultural life in the final years of the Soviet Union and early post-Soviet period. He also coordinates Toronto Jewry and the coronavirus pandemic, an oral history project about the impact of COVID-19 on Jewish communal life in Toronto. So these are our speakers. I'm now going to leave it to Valentina. Valentina, you have 20 minutes. I'm very excited to hear what you have to say. Go ahead.
I'm going to share my screen. Thank you very much. Thank you to you all to be here in this Sunday morning. So as you heard at the beginning, my title, the title of my presentation and my presentation was in French. But after seeing that I was the first to open the dance and that I was the only one speaking in French, I decided to switch to English and to do my presentation in English. And as I will try to show, this is part of what we are talking today, meaning the fact that the Canadian Jewish Studies is a mainly English-speaking field. So I'm gonna stop. It's not gonna work. Okay. Also, so the topic I would like to discuss with you today is the intersection of gender and Canadian Jewish Studies. And interesting enough, the conversation about gender and Jewish studies is going on since a couple of years, mainly in English and mainly in the United States. And just to mention a few examples, the 2019 number of ACJS magazine, Perspective, dedicated the entire issues to the issue of patriarchy. And there were, in the forward, a conversation was going on between 2019 and 2020 about the position of women in Jewish studies, meaning women scholars, but also research about women in Jewish studies. So when I saw the subject of this conference, reflecting on Canadian Jewish studies, I thought that it would have been interesting and it would have been a good occasion to reflect on how the concept of gender and Jewish studies in general are dealt in the northern side of the border, so in Canadian Jewish studies. An exercise that, to my knowledge, has not yet been done. Of course, this question arose from a personal research interest at the intersection of gender and Canadian Jewish studies, as my doctoral research, as just mentioned, deals with the construction of gender among Hasidic Jewish women in Montreal. And I was quickly facing the fact that there were very little research dealing with Hasidic women in Canada, and almost no study using the concept of gender as an analytical concept and dealing with sexual minority or masculinity in regarding Hasidic Jews. So I then decided to look broadly at what was going on and what is going on in the field of Jewish studies by doing a literature review. So how I did my literature review, very quickly, I had to define what I mean by Canadian Jewish studies. And I follow the definition that Newton gives in his very recent book, Jewish Studies, A Counterlife. So Adam Zachary Newton claims that Jewish studies denote multiple things, from a data field to a program or a minor or a department minor or a minor. So in my literature review, so it's a field that is a multiple field. There is a lot of things coming in, and it's very hard to trace the border of this field. So for my literature review, Canadian Jewish Studies stands for the article from Canadian Jewish Studies Review, both in French and in English, between 1993, the years the review was created, and 2020, and the publication from academic scholars affiliated to a research center, a chair, a program, or a department in Jewish studies in Canada, both in French and in English. So what this literature review tells us about gender and Canadian Jewish studies. So if we start from the article from the Canadian Jewish Studies, we can have an overview of how gender started to find its place in Canadian Jewish studies from 1993 to 2020. So in this range, the article, I did the research on the website, and I found that 10 articles mention the word gender. So my research was really focused on gender, not on women, but gender, not on feminism, not on masculinity, but really gender. And only 10 articles deal with gender between 1993 and 2020. One of these articles is a bibliography named Women, and is part of the 7A number of 2020, which is the entire issue is dedicated to a bibliography of all the work done on Canadian Jewish studies. So, and one of the entry is women. So this particular article allows us to go back 4 years, because it's a bibliography that goes since 1965 to 2000. And what we can see is that, so there are 35 sources, which is quite a lot if compared to other entries that are the most important, like Montreal or Toronto, which have about 50 entries, between 50 and 60 entries. In these 35 sources, gender is mentioned only 2 times, and there are two historical female historians who did the research about les mouvements ouvriers, how I'm missing the English word, the labor movement in Toronto. So, and the place of women and in general, the gender relationship between men and women in the Toronto movement. So what is interesting, is that only a few sources, historical sources, deal with the concept of gender. And then what is really interesting is that in 2000, women is still an entry in the bibliography, meaning that we still think that women can be considered as a category apart. For example, there is no an entry for men. We assume that men are the universal of the other category, but for women we have a specific category. So what about the other sources? So there were 10 sources. The one that we saw is one source. The other 9, we can see that they still mainly deal with history. So female historians are among the main scholars mobilizing gender. So there are 5 sources who deals with gender and are in the history discipline. And there are the other are literature sources, 3 entries, and only 1 in social science. So the main trend is that and out of 10, 9 are written in English and only 1 in French. So the main trends show that English-speaking sources are the large majority, as well the focus on the past. Also, for example, the literature sources deal with an author that wrote novels about and books about her Holocaust experience. So they mainly deal with the past. So the concept made a late entrance in Canadian Jewish studies. It was used, as I saw, 2 times around in the 90s, and then it was started to be used more around the end 2009, 2010. And what we can see is that gender is still equal to women. So there is no studies about masculinity. There's no study about gender, sexual minority, but and also little theorization of gender. So what is going on now? If we take a look, as I did, to the Department of Jewish Studies, all the program in Jewish study in our Canadian university, what I found is that the number of scholars working on gender is increasing, but remains limited. So I found that around 20 person, and I would say women mainly, there are 18 women and 2 men, are working on gender-related issues out of 135 scholars. What we see is that history remains an important field where gender is explored. So mainly it's still the discipline where gender is mobilized, but other fields are joining the conversation. And these fields are religious studies, mainly feminist biblical exegesis of the Bible, literature, we had a few sources already in the 90s, but there are it's an increasing number of scholars that deal with gender and literature. And we are a few anthropological contributions. So social science remains still remain on the margin of the discussion of gender. We have the contribution of Babel Joseph, of course, on Iraqi women in Montreal, and the contribution of that are going. It's a study that is going on of Deidre Butler and Bettina Appel-Kuzmarov on the Get, the Jewish divorce in Canadian courts. And we also have a few contributions that are more reflection on feminism and Jewishness in the Canadian context. So what we can say is that English-speaking scholars remain the majority, but French scholars start to join the conversation. Yolande Cohen, she has a research chair at UQAM. Anne Letourneau and Guadalupe Gonzalez at the Université de Montréal are in biblical studies and literature and deals with gender. And Sonia Sarah Lipstick also contributed to the reflection, to the feminist lecture reading of the Bible. So French is starting to take in place, but English remained the majority. And as we observed before, gender remains little discussed and is still equal to women. So there is not a lot of theorization. When there is the word gender, mainly that we speak about women, and there is an exception, and is the work of Bader at the University of Manitoba, that is using the gender studies in order to study Jewish masculinities among German Jews. And still, what is interesting is that the concept of masculinity is brought to Jewish studies, but it still remains related to the past of the Jewish studies. So according to this short literature review, what we can draw as the main contribution that gender and gender study brought and still bring to Canadian Jewish studies, I think that we can point out three main lessons. Gender studies continue to draw attention to women's and women's experience in Canadian Jewish studies, behind just adding women to the conversation, but showing that the story and the history is incomplete if it's just about men, and if it's just told by men and about men. And an example is the work of Shayna Trimble, that she did a research who was published in the Canadian Jewish Studies Journal, that where she demonstrates how, despite its crucial contribution, None is Too Many, the famous book of Abela and Tropper, remain a story of men. So her research deals with the contribution of women in the Canadian Jewish Congress program to bring 1,000 Jewish orphans to Canada. So she showed how women contributed to this program, and this went overlooked in None is Too Many's book. So second, gender studies challenge a patriarchal masculine reading of Jewishness. So the biblical exegetic studies show how we can have a different reading of the sources, and also we can all the contribution that join feminism and the Canadian Jewish context to a certain extent bring another perspective on what's going on in Canada relating to Jew and Jewishness from the point of view of women. And finally, one of the main contributions is that gender studies and more broadly feminist studies help to deprovincialize Canadian Jewish studies, allowing the field to engage in contemporary debates that connect broadly with larger issues. And I'm thinking again about the conversation about feminism and in the Canadian Jewish field, and feminism and being a Canadian Jewish woman. What does it mean, and what is mean to be a feminist Canadian Jewish woman? This allow from one side to bring a broader conversation, the conversation about feminism that is going on in the society into Canadian Jewish studies, but at the same time allow the scholars to bring the Jewish experience in the main conversation about feminism. So, and I would like to conclude my presentation by pointing out to some of the challenges that I see for the near future of Canadian Jewish studies regarding to gender, but in general as well, and some of the limits of my work that surely need to be improved. So what we can tell is we can hope for more studies where gender is used as an analytical tool, as well as studies on masculinities and sexual minorities, which are really still on the margin. As I mentioned, there is just one study on masculinities and no studies on sexual minorities. It will also be interesting to hear more about women of non-Ashkenazi descent. We have some research, as I mentioned, Yolande Cohen, Norma Bauman-Joseph, they deal with Iraqi women and Sephardi Moroccan women, but still we can hope for more about non-Ashkenazi descent women. And for sure, we can hope for more French and social science contribution. And that brings me to talk about how gender and to talk about gender, as it has been repeated many, many times, allow us to bring a reflection of the field of Canadian Jewish studies in general. In Canadian Jewish studies, we have Canadian Jewish studies are dominated by English-speaking scholars and historians, as this presentation shows. So I'm not criticizing that, I'm just pointing out to that, and I think there are structural reasons that demonstrate that create this condition where Canadian Jewish studies are organized more around English speaking and history. So I think that one of the reasons that we should think about is the fact that yes, gender-related studies about Jewish studies, Canadian Jewish studies, are mainly in English and are mainly in history. But because our field, Canadian Jewish study, is mainly historical and mainly Anglophone. But we could also think about how the broader academic field allowed to have more scholars working in contemporary Jewry and in contemporary Jewry in a Francophone setting. So the question that we can ask is how can we have more scholars working in French universities? And then this is something that goes behind also the let's say the power of Canadian Jewish studies scholars. It goes to what the academic field allow the scholars to be part of. Another factor that influence the fact that Canadian Jewish studies field is mainly in English and gender and Canadian Jewish studies field is mainly in English is our connection with the United States. So a lot of conversation are going on between Canadian Jewish studies and American Jewish studies, and they are mainly in English, and it's inevitable. But it will be interesting to develop a conversation that will focus more on Canadian Jewish studies. And that brings me to my last point, and the fact that, which is the fact that my presentation, my research is the first on the issues, to my knowledge, and it needs to be improved because, for example, it deals mainly with the core of what we can call Canadian Jewish studies. So I went really through the department. So it means in the department, the program, and the chairs in Canada. So meaning that it's just the scholar who have a full position that were part of my research, and which leave aside, for example, PhD candidates. That are a lot, and there are a lot working on gender related issues and French related in French. The fact of focusing on the core of Canadian Jewish study also leave aside what is outside of the publication that are not in Canadian Jewish studies, but it are in another journal, and it's probably that researcher engage in conversation that are not just that are in other journals and not just in Canadian Jewish Studies journals, because that's also how they can publish more and have more connection with the United States, for example. That's why it's mainly in English. And finally, I also, in my research, what is not considered is what all the publication that are not in the academy. So I really focus on the academy, and I think that it will be interesting to expand my work and to see what's going on the margin, because I think that the margin could be the future of gender and Canadian Jewish studies, and maybe of Canadian Jewish studies in general. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Valentina. That was really interesting to start the conference with something about the field. So that was really enjoyable. Thank you. We're going to go straight into the next one. And then, like I said, we'll have question period after everybody's spoken. So I'll leave it to Jonathan Slater now with So Near Yet So Far, an assessment of the 2018 survey of Jews in Canada. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Thank you so much. And I hope everybody can hear me. Good morning. When I originally set out to deliver this talk well over a year ago, my intention was to offer some observations and reflections on the 2018 survey of Jews in Canada, fairly comprehensive perspective on Jewish identity in Canada. Environics Institute for Research published the report mostly in response to a portrait of Jewish Americans, a 2013 Pew Research Center analysis of American Jewish life. My desire at the time I proposed this topic was quite modest: discuss and compare the salient findings of both the Canadian and US reports, and possibly venture some pithy insights from such analysis. However, as we all know too well, a lot can happen in a year. The cancellation of last year's ACJS conference did not result in a mere postponement of what I wished to talk about last spring. It thoroughly reoriented the context of what I will be sharing with you today. Until 2 weeks ago, my remarks were to center on and contrast the respective merits of the 2018 Canadian survey and the 2013 US survey. But as you all are likely aware by now, on Tuesday, May 11th, Pew released ahead of schedule a new survey report. I would hesitate to label it an update, titled Jewish Americans in 2020. I viewed the publication of the report as both a blessing and curse. A blessing in that the 2013 report was already growing hair, and a 2020 refresh would mean that new data points might offer some curious and possibly revelatory longitudinal learnings. A curse in that the 2018 Canadian report was expressly crafted with the idea to respond to the 2013 Pew study and to lay out and explicate the differences between Canadian Jewry and US Jewry, and in the process dispel certain preconceived notions and myths about similarities across the two populations. Further, I was certain that the just published 250-page Pew study was not going to be a fast or easy read, just days away from this esteemed gathering. Thus, I was grateful for various cheat sheets a handful of American Jewish organizations and media outlets graciously issued within the first few days after publication. And I counted myself lucky that Hebrew Union College just days ago held a webinar about the Pew study that brought together the seminary's Sarah Bunin-Benor, professor of contemporary Jewish studies, Bruce Phillips, professor of sociology, and Pew Research Center Director Alan Cooperman in an enlightening presentation about the 2020 survey results and their implications. The 2018 Canadian survey was produced in partnership with the University of Toronto and York University. Its format clearly echoes that of the 2013 Pew report, focusing on larger patterns of Jewish practice and social trends and Jewish lifestyles, as well as on personal experiences of anti-Semitism, relationships to Israel, and affinities with Jewish movements and organizations. Central to the report is the depiction of the contrasting ways Canadian and US Jews define themselves. Further, the Canadian study appears to provide evidence of the pronounced manner in which Jewish identity in the 21st century is developing, and in certain respects diverging within the two countries. The Canadian survey in particular tends to disconfirm any notion of a uniform social, historical, and ideological experience among North American Jews. Such results, of course, possess significant importance for the future of Jewish communities on both sides of the border, One might contend, hopefully, that this research ought to elicit some degree of communal reflection and real-world analysis of social, political, economic, cultural, and spiritual expectations within North American Jewish communities. The data also convey potential implications for the comparative study of contemporary Jewish life on both sides of the border. Both the 2018 and 2013 reports would also seem to suggest a need to examine these implications in the context of Jewish studies pedagogy, especially in North America. So what I shall attempt here today is merely revisit the major findings of the 2018 Survey of Jews in Canada and to summarize the findings of the 2020 Pew study just published days ago. Now, when teaching students ways to analyze case studies, I often raise the point that events generally do not occur in isolation, and to understand what has happened already and what is happening now means uncovering both the overt and subtle ways such events are influenced and shaped by all types of environmental factors, many of which are outside our immediate individual and collective control. It is therefore with some degree of regret and a certain profound sense of grief that I acknowledge we are assembled here over the next couple of days, speaking to one another in impassioned tones about Jewish subject matter, while the horrifying events in Israel of the last 2 weeks cast their grim shadow on these proceedings. However, we should by no means view the proximity of current events to our present meeting as ironic, but rather as an affirmation of Jewish reality in the 21st century. And the studies I will be referring to have much to say about the significance of Israel in the lives of Jews in both Canada and the US. Both studies also add to our understanding of the disturbing and escalating incidents of anti-Semitism in both Canada and the US within the last several years. Monitoring by law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border and independent observation by such organizations as the ADL, Simon Wiesenthal Center, B'nai Brit, and Hillel International paint a similar picture of a rising tide of violence against Jews in Canada and in the US. We only need scan the headlines about incidents in Montreal and Toronto from the last 2 weeks to appreciate how easily some members of a civilized society can lapse into promulgating hateful fallacies and act out through physical and psychological aggression. On a positive note, May happens to be Jewish Heritage Month on both sides of the border, and appropriately, Canada is once again in census mode. I think we can all agree on what a disaster the 2011 census was for Canada's Jewish population, when Stephen Harper's federal government eliminated the mandatory long-form census questionnaire and replaced it with a voluntary national household survey, a move that led to a serious undercount of Jews in Canada. Memories of that time still touch a raw nerve among Canadian Jews, which perhaps explains the intensive push by a number of Canadian Jewish organizations to make absolutely sure households with Jews do not ignore question 23 about ethnic ancestry and question 30 about religion in the long-form census survey. I bring up the census because as one more mechanism for data collection, the census can help us to understand the social, political, and economic forces affecting the flourishing of contemporary Jewish life in Canada. We only need look at the Torah portions of the last 2 weeks to comprehend just how vital the census had been to the survival of the Israelites during their post-Exodus wanderings. Parashat Bamidbar begins and Parashat Naso completes the account of how adult men from among the tribes were enumerated for the sole purpose of raising a fighting army, an army that had to defend the community against groups hostile to the Israelites and called upon to take the initiative offensively as circumstances dictated. While demographics may not be destiny, demographics undoubtedly drives democracy. Census data is useful for an efficient government allotment of resources and establishing a firm understanding of a country's ethnic, religious, and linguistic diversity. Demographic segmenting sits at the foundation of psychographic segmentation used in political polling and public opinion research. A census can, of course, also become a political weapon, as has been the case historically in the US, where gerrymandering and redistricting based on population shifts traditionally have served as a means to minimize the sway of one or another party among a set of census tracts, and to undermine the voting power of underrepresented minority groups in certain geographic regions. So, what were the major takeaways from the 2018 Environics report in relation to the 2013 Pew figures? Broadly, Canadian and American Jews identified as Jewish in similar ways. Canadian Jews were more likely to pin their identities to a combination of religion, culture, and ancestry, rather than to one of those aspects in particular. Canadian Jews were more likely than American Jews to express that community, religion, and belief in God were important. Both Canadian and American Jews appeared to be religiously affiliated in equal proportions, 60% identifying with one of the three principal denominations. Canadian Jews, however, were twice as likely to be synagogue members, more eager to join and donate to Jewish causes and organizations, and in general had more Jewish friends than did American Jews. One of the major distinctions between Canadian and American Jewish communities was the emphasis on Jewish education while growing up. While Canadian and American Jews reported equally that they were brought up in the Jewish religion, American Jews were far less likely to have attended a Jewish school or school program or Jewish summer camp. Canadian Jews appeared to possess superior Hebrew literacy and had a slightly higher proportion of the population becoming bar and bat mitzvah. As of the 2018 report, intermarriage across all ethnic and religious groups in Canada was increasing, but was accelerating among Jews. However, intermarriage rates were still less common among Canadian Jews than for American Jews, and Canadian Jewish parents were more likely to raise their children in the Jewish religion. The disparity was even more pronounced in denominationally unaffiliated households. The 2013 Pew survey did not contain many of the questions about discrimination and anti-Semitism posed in the Environics study, so sufficient comparisons could not be made. Canadian and American Jews were equally likely to have been called names and slighted in social settings. Both groups thought they were less likely to be targets of hate than other groups, for example, Blacks, Muslims. Canadian Jews exhibited a more powerful connection to Israel than did American Jews. Excuse me. They were more strongly attached to Israel and paid double the visits to the country. Nonetheless, the divide among the spectrum of opinion about the political situation in Israel tended to be the same on both sides of the border. Canadian Jews, however, demonstrated a greater reluctance to express an opinion. So what have been the developments over 7 years in the US? Because the methodology has changed from the 2013 Pew study, the Pew Center cautions against making any direct comparisons between the earlier data and the data in the 2021 edition. The Jewish population of the United States has grown in that time to 7.5 million souls, and more than 1 million American Jewish adults purport to be what Pew describes as Jews of no religion. The denominational balance remains largely unchanged. However, more Jewish youth claim to be Orthodox or unaffiliated than in the earlier study. The vast majority of Orthodox respondents said that observing Jewish law was essential to being Jewish, while respondents among other denominations did not feel as strongly about the need to follow Jewish law in order to be Jewish. Interestingly, the study draws our attention to the possible institutional biases toward Jews of color. The survey specifically avoided use of the term, but rather depended on conventional census nomenclature to delineate identity. 15% of young Jews in America identify as non-white, which in my opinion ought to be a conversation starter in many of our Jewish institutional settings, regardless of the border. 2/3 of American Jews identify as Ashkenazi, 3% identify as Sephardic, and 1% identify as Mizrahi. BDS activism resonates positively among 10% of American Jews. 43% oppose the BDS movement, and the remainder either hold no opinion or have not heard anything about BDS. The number of intermarriages in the US remains steady, relatively unchanged from 2013. 42% of married Jews have a non-Jewish spouse. Intermarried couples are less likely to raise their children as Jews. Slightly less than 1/2 of adult children coming from intermarried households appear to have remained Jewish, and that number seems to be on the rise. The 2021 study, unlike the 2013 survey, did not shirk questions about anti-Semitism. Most Jews in America think anti-Semitism is a growing problem in the nation. They feel less safe than in earlier times. More than 1/2 of American Jews reporting have experienced some form of anti-Semitism. In a similar vein, 3/4 of American Jews say that remembering the Holocaust is fundamental to leading a Jewish life. In the 2018 Canadian study, 72% of respondents said the same. There are two caveats I wish to put forward about interpreting both of these studies. The first caveat I would like to invoke relates to the manner in which we can play fast and loose with cause and effect in history. We often are tempted to seek direct links between current outcomes and the historical trends and events that might have fostered those outcomes. The astute historian is cognizant that generative circumstances often are buffeted by forces and counterforces and can be confounded by seemingly benign events unfolding in parallel. Further, what passes for a cause might itself be an effect of earlier causal circumstances. Thus, in comparing Jewish experience in Canada with Jewish experience in the US, we must exercise caution in ascribing similar roots to those experiences. Jonathan Sarna, for example, explains how the Civil War acted as a watershed moment in the evolution of Jewish prosperity and status in the newly reconstructed United States. It would be incumbent upon us, therefore, to exercise caution in drawing parallels for any such elevation of Jews in Canada at roughly the same time. Another example might be immigration. Vast waves of immigrants, not only Jewish immigrants from Central and Eastern Europe, flooded American shores for the better part of the 19th century and into the early part of the 20th century. The US was the largest recipient of immigrant populations at that time. Canada too welcomed European immigrants. Like the Jews who fled the US, Jewish immigrants to Canada fled to the US, Jewish immigrants to Canada left their homes for more or less the same reasons: the prospect of a better life and the promise of freedom from oppression and poverty abroad. We would be guilty of promoting an overgeneralization were we to argue that the immigrant experiences in both countries were equivalent and that they molded future Jewish life in an identical manner. The second caveat centers on the significance of the reports themselves. The research organizations that compiled and tabulated all the data are to be commended on their thoroughness and diligence. The data are broad in scope and deep in detail. They seem devoid of any political bias or hidden public policy agenda. The respective study's attention to detail and precision ought to reassure us of the factual accuracy of the report. Yet we should not be lured into thinking the studies tell us the whole truth about Jewish life in North America. As Alfred Korzybski, founder of the general semantics movement, wrote, "The map is not the territory. The survey, I would argue, is not the narrative. Statistics paint only a surface picture." For such a narrative about being Jewish in Canada, we should turn our attention, for instance, to the rich ethnographic accounts and social scientific analysis that have come our way most recently. I would refer you to the second edition of Morton Weinfeld's very accessible, Like Everyone Else, but Different, and David S. Kaufman's No Better Home, lush with expert analysis and reflections by a number of Canada's distinguished and authoritative Jewish studies scholars. Pierre Antil's comprehensive Histoire des Juifs du Québec also stands among the top of the list. For a comparative US perspective, I would recommend Neither in Dark Speeches nor in Similitudes, deftly edited by Barry Stiefel and Hernan Tesler-Mabé, whose contributors provide an excellent and eloquent examination of the ways the boundary line between the two nations has either helped or hindered the evolution of differences in Jewish experience. For a more complex appreciation of Jewish life in America, I would turn to the second edition of Jonathan Sarna's brilliant American Judaism, and for in-depth historical background to Hasia Diner's The Jews of the United States, 1654 to 2000. My proposed reading list is far from exhaustive. There are certainly many more excellent treatments about Jews in Canada and the United States with which we can equip ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was really excellent. We'll move straight into Joshua Tapper's paper. It is titled Crisis Leadership and Community Upheaval, Findings from Toronto Jewry and the Coronavirus Pandemic, an Oral History Project. Go ahead, Josh.
Okay, let me just share my screen. Can I get a thumbs up or a head nod that my okay, the slide's visible? Great. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Jesse, for the introduction. I hate technology. I hate its encroachment into our lives. I believe very strongly that we need to protect sacred time and sacred space and make them technology free. These are the words of a rabbi at a conservative synagogue in Toronto from an interview conducted in June 2020 for a project called Toronto Jewry and the COVID-19 pandemic, and oral history. We had been discussing some of the challenges he faced while crafting his synagogue's virtual worship policy in accordance with his interpretation of halakha, or Jewish law. The conversation turned to Passover, and the rabbi recounted how his decision to relax his synagogue's strict no technology guidance during Passover was informed in part by an agonizing personal decision about whether to include his widowed, out-of-town father in his family's Seder over Zoom. And so he continued. It's very easy for me to say, keep technology out. I'm a family. I get to spend Passover with my 3 kids, my wife. It's something very different to tell a person who's all alone that you can't have a Seder. Now, it just so happens I have a father who's in that category. He had nobody. So I had to make a decision for myself. Am I going to leave my dad alone on Pesach, or should I Zoom him in? How am I going to explain this to my kids who know we don't use technology in our house? So I made the decision. We're going to do Zoom. And I said, you know, there are some moments in life where you have to weigh values against each other. The rabbi goes on to explain how he wouldn't be able to look at himself in the mirror if he opted against Zooming in his father. And so he declared publicly to his congregation that they should Zoom their Seders as well. This fraught duality between personal experience and responsibility to institutional norms and procedures is one of several themes emerging in this ongoing history project, which I initiated in April of 2020, shortly after Toronto began its reckoning. Well, Toronto and much of Canada and the world, of course, began its reckoning with the COVID-19 pandemic. In this presentation, I'll share some preliminary insights from Toronto Jewry and the COVID-19 pandemic and oral history, and later on introduce some of my methodological concerns around conducting oral histories during a sustained period of crisis. The project was conceived as a way to document through personal narrative how the pressures of the pandemic were affecting structural and cultural shifts in Toronto's Jewish community, and how the crisis was reshaping the way local Jewish institutions engage with their members or clients or constituents. The project now counts around 50 interviews with community leaders. These are rabbis and synagogue presidents across denominations, heads of Jewish day schools, heads of direct service agencies, bereavement professionals, federation leaders, just to name a handful of the sectors included in the collection thus far. And these are people who carry some measure of responsibility for the health and sustainability of Jewish institutional life in Toronto. Now, each narrator will be interviewed a second time. I expect sometime in 2022 to return to the first conversation and reflect on the longer arc of the pandemic. And I'm happy to talk more about this methodology in the Q&A. These interviews typically last 1 to 3 hours, sometimes over multiple sessions. And for the most part, they're conducted over Zoom, which of course is a highly imperfect and mediated form of communication, but one that in addition to being logistically necessary during a pandemic adds a layer of depth to the material and the kinds of visual information that is captured in the course of an interview, even the fragmentations in narrative caused by technology that I believe has historical and archival relevance. And on that note, I do want to mention that the project is unfolding in collaboration with the Ontario Jewish Archives in Toronto, which will serve as a home for the collection in the future. The project aims to collect institutional responses to the crisis. So the interviews are partly designed to elicit minute details about the functioning of Jewish institutions during the pandemic, like how synagogues grappled with programming disruptions and financial distress, how, for instance, the local UJA Federation marshaled its considerable financial resources and social capital to support a wide array of Jewish services, or how schools responded to yo-yoing provincial policies around in-class and remote learning. In doing so, the interviews also collect data on the myriad ways COVID has put stress on Jewish communities, including forced adaptation to ritual behavior, life cycle events, the challenges of community engagement in a virtual environment, and the importance or lack thereof of physical space in communal life. And on the flip side, they uncover the behind the scenes mechanics of creative response, not just how synagogues and other institutions adjusted to their new online realities, but the emotional and psychological freight leaders carried in the course of making these moves. So while in some ways the interviews function as self-contained institutional microhistories, there are, of course, limitations to this approach. These are top-down narratives. And while much can be gleaned, I think, about everyday life from people in positions of leadership, my sample is limited. One or two in-depth interviews with decision makers from a particular organization cannot give us a full perspective of the life of an institution during the COVID-19 pandemic. But still, when considered together, the interviews begin to tell a larger, more textured story of communal resilience, networking, quick pivots, the triumphs of rapid mobilization, but also where the story is more complicated. The realities of internal politics, frustrations with government policy, and despair over the pandemic-induced erosion of Jewish religious norms. Several rabbis, for instance, have described these tensions manifesting in uncomfortable disagreements with the boards of their synagogues. Indeed, their narratives often stray from the dilemmas of ritual practice during the pandemic, like how to preserve the logic of Jewish ritual life, and center on questions of morality and collective responsibility. Where are their priorities, they wonder, to the institution, to their congregants, to themselves as individuals? One rabbi of a small congregation in the Toronto suburb of Thornhill described a sense of duty he felt in early March of 2020 to restrict the number of people allowed in the synagogue building at any given time, and both for his own health and safety and that of his congregants. And this was before the province of Ontario's recommendation on March 16th of last year that houses of worship closed their doors. However, his board overruled him, forcing the synagogue to stay open for a period of time. It was a decision the rabbi sympathized with, but still felt put lives at risk, one that forced him into an uncomfortable position as the primary point of physical contact between the synagogue and its congregants. Echoing this sentiment, another rabbi of an Orthodox synagogue struggled with the limitations placed on his capacity as a leader. Rather than enlarge his role as leader, the crisis restricted it, sidelining him from synagogue operations when he felt he should have been centered. Here he is. I'm facing within my congregation challenges about my role as a leader, not in that people are unhappy with what I'm doing as a rabbi, but in certain ways I'm being told to stay in my swim lane, to not engage in issues of leadership that I feel are critical to the well-being of my people and my institution. I'm being told that, that's not the rabbi's job. That's in terms of fundraising, in terms of staffing, in terms of all sorts of different pieces that, from my perspective, are critical to the culture and the message that a congregation creates in terms of how it treats people. I find that in many respects, in dealing with this crisis, I'm a little bit hamstrung in that the needed governance changes were not put in place. And I don't have the team that I would most most like to have to face these challenging times. And that's very difficult. In terms of my understanding of what is required of leaders is that you need to meet the needs of your people for leadership. And there's a greater need for leadership in times of crisis like this. Both of these narratives highlight the emphasis that narrators place on leadership. And while these two examples are from rabbis, it's possible to generalize across the various sectors represented in the collection. In the interviews, narrators differentiate between a time before the pandemic when they viewed themselves primarily as service providers to during the pandemic, when their degree of engagement with their micro communities has evolved or amplified to a point where they now identify themselves as caregivers. Here is another rabbi. There's sort of like a re-emphasis of the humanity of your leadership. They're looking at you as, and they being the congregants, who are they going to call when things go wrong? And I've told them throughout this that I am there for them. I will take care of you. So in some ways, I've been able to re-engage them with the idea that I'm here to take care of them in a way that I never would have spoken before, because I wasn't there to take care of them. I was there to help them. But now I'm there to literally take care, whether they're dying or whether they're afraid or whether they're hungry. So as you might expect, the interviews also operate on a personal register. Narrators express regret for failing to meet the needs of their communities as they balance the stress of their private lives. They point to the ontological insecurities of life during the pandemic, the emotional angst, fatigue, fear, and uncertainty about the future. And on that last note, they ponder existential questions about the shape of communal Jewish life in the pandemic's present and post-pandemic future. Some reflect on and often question the need for change or adaptation in Jewish communal infrastructure, longing instead for a pre-pandemic past. Others embrace the possibilities for change and speak in terms of restoration versus renovation and what will be returned to normal, what will be overhauled. These testimonies are not policy recommendations necessarily, but they provide space for leaders to reflect on communal needs while confronting directly what they see as a major historical inflection point. Here is an executive at a Jewish community center in Toronto describing the impact of the pandemic on the institution's mission. Every organization that has a building, we are captive to the desire to draw people to it. So now the question is, we crave connection as much as the person who loved the community center craves connection. But I think they crave the village. They craved walking in somewhere where they were known and recognized, and where they were likely to bump into other people that they knew and they recognized. Exactly why people join synagogues and love to go, because they show up and they feel seen. So it's been a really interesting shift in our thinking that we have to think about our programming in two ways. What's the content and what's the relational imperative? What is actually happening in that communal experience? We are hyper-focused on the relational aspect of our mission, where I think before it was, we provide recreation, education. It was like a list of offerings and services. That's the how, but it's not the why. So by way of conclusion, I'd like to reflect for a moment on methodology, and by extension, make maybe an abbreviated case for carrying out oral history in the midst of a crisis period. One of the questions I asked myself at the outset of this research was how much value there would be in interviews conducted without the perspective of temporal distance, as events were sure to evolve, responses and decisions to evolve with them, what might be lost in narratives recorded in, say, summer 2020, and what comparative value would they have with narratives recorded in early 2021? The oral historian, oral history theorist Alessandro Portelli argues that oral history is as preoccupied with the time a narrative is recorded, what he calls the time of telling, as it is with when events in question took place, that is, the details about events that happened in the past. And as Portelli reminds us, oral history helps us develop insight into how people understood events and how events and other forces affected their lives. It records how people make meaning of the past, and in this case, their present. So in capturing oral histories mid-crisis, we should understand that individual experiences, attitudes, conclusions are subject to change. They might be revised by narrators over time or become subject to a broader collective narrative or memory regime. So with this first round of interviews, narrators are rehearsing their experience of the pandemic in the present, because neither the narrator nor myself, the interviewer, as co-creators of the oral history, are operating with the power of retrospection. The narratives perhaps better capture how narrators' emotions, moods, and thought processes were actually experienced during the events in question. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. That was really excellent, very poignant. A lot of the kinds of questions that Hernan and I had when we were coming up with this online conference. How would it go that we can't be in person? We love seeing everybody. Okay, so we're going to do a question period now. I will just remind you and tell the people who came in a little bit after my initial spiel. That essentially, if you have any questions, you could let me know in the chat, or you can raise your hand. I believe on the bottom bar under reactions, you can raise your hand if you have a question. And I will call upon you. And this is just a reminder, we're looking for questions, not comments. As quick as possible. So let me just change my view here so I can see everybody. That didn't do it. Hold on one moment. This is the kind of hiccup I was talking about. Does anybody have a question? The chat. Okay, I actually can't see the chat, Thea, so if you could copy paste and send them to me, then I'll be able to ask. Oh yeah, okay, so under participants, you should be able to raise your hand, I believe. Okay, Hernan, I'm gonna ask you to unmute. There you go.
Thank you very much. First of all, I just want to thank all three presenters. They're absolutely fascinating presentations. I'll limit my questions to literally questions. I'm just going to start with Valentina first, and then hopefully somebody else can ask other questions. But the question about, or the matter of masculinities, this boundary of gender equals women's studies, and how this is there's not that much work taking place in gender as masculinity. Could you elaborate on that and why you think this is not the case, and you think that this will change, and do you see any sort of promising directions of amplifying the way that we conceive of gender as a category that is not just women or men, and more broadly speaking? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. The reason why there is no studies about masculinities, well, in general, in gender studies, masculinities is a very recent subject. So even if, but if we look at Canadian American Jewish studies, that's where it's kind of our mirror to understand, as Jonathan Sadler told us, to understand what's going on here. There are a few studies that have been done there. I'm thinking about Sarah Himoff's book about Jewish masculinities in the States. And there are a few works, a few contribution, more than a few contribution about in queer studies, so about sexual minorities. And I was actually chatting with Randall Schnorr that he was telling me that he worked a little bit about gay Jewish people in Toronto, and so I would be very happy to include that in my literature review. And also he was mentioning that in the book of not a better home, like everyone else but different, there is a chapter, it's a chapter about family, which is interesting enough. We talk about family, but in the chapter we talk a little bit about gay people. So I think that is slowly taking its place, and I think it's organic in how the Canadian Jewish studies are developing. What it will be interesting, and what also my review literature shows, is that it's mainly women that studies women, which to a certain extent it's okay, it's what we need, that's what it takes. It's a balance, because that's what women were claiming for many years, that we're not talking about women, that now we are kind of balancing and asking ourselves, well, we can also talk about men, but men from a gender studies perspective, not men as the universal reference. And I think it will take men to talk about that. And I think a great conversation with Ara was on the topic and on Canadian Jewish studies as well. And I think in the next years, as I pointed out, I have a lot of trust in new PhD students and young scholars by doing that.
Awesome. Hernan, I'm just going to interrupt you. You can ask your next two questions in a second. We have another question from Megan. So Megan, we can have you unmute. There we go.
Hi, my question's for Jonathan Slater. First of all, thank you everybody for your wonderful presentations. I attended at the Soloway Jewish Community Center in Ottawa. They did a presentation about the survey when, I guess, shortly after it came out, the Survey of Jews in Canada from 2018. And I realized, and I'll use it in my research, and I realized upon looking at it, it only interviews surveys Jews in select communities across Canada. And so how do you think the results might be different, or how do you think they would be affected by taking into consideration Jews in other communities in Canada, such as here in Ottawa, which I don't think they were surveyed here?
Excellent sort of query there. It's always tempting to get into the world of counterfactuals. What if we had done this? What would have the results look like if we had not done these communities? So it's all very speculative, and that's part of my my second caveat at the end of my talk, is that we can, with a demographic survey of this nature, we can hardly expect it to paint an adequate portrait, and that we have to draw limited conclusions from limited information. And I think that's always the scholar's challenge. I would not necessarily find that daunting. As a matter of fact, I would rise to that challenge. I would recommend that you rise to that challenge and seek out data from other sources. There have been other much more finite types of surveys of Jewish life in Canada over recent years. The environic study, of course, is the most substantial. And of course, in itself, it tried to mimic the Pew study, which, if you think about it, yeah, I can understand, Canada always, maybe because we here in Canada see ourselves in a sort of a one down position against the behemoth of the United States. But nonetheless, I mean, it was a modest attempt at doing something. I think that the time will come, maybe in the next 5 years, when there can be a reboot of this study without necessarily worrying about what's going on in the States, not dismissing it entirely. So, and I would refer you to the much richer material, the much richer literature that we now have at our disposal that's come to us in these last few years, which I mentioned, that have really, really great, not only quantitative, but qualitative data that I think tells us far more than a survey can tell us.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan. Hernan, did you have a second question?
Yeah, I thank you very much. I mean, I don't want to hog the question period, so if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to defer. But
yeah, please raise your hand if you have any questions.
Yeah, so we'd love to have these as really interesting discussions. So if other people have questions, please. I'll ask the one. I'm just going in order here. So the two things for Jonathan. Number one, I wasn't sure if I heard right your response to the matter of Jews identifying as being non-white. So I don't know if you could clarify that and what the implications of that are, given the directions that we're going in terms of race, both in Canada and the United States. And then sort of more broadly, if you can comment on whether Canadian and US Jewry are moving further apart or closer together. And then I'll just ask my last questions for Josh. I just wonder if you're going to expand this study in any way, or if there would be a meaningful, if it would be meaningful to sort of look at historical parallels of crisis, whether it be going back to the Spanish flu or during obviously the Second World War and the Holocaust, and whether that can help us learn a little bit more about where the Jewish community is today relative to the past. And thank you very much again to everyone.
Okay, so you want me? I'll respond to your two questions, Hernan. On the matter of Jews of color, this has become the spotlight has been shining for, especially in the last year, especially within the context of the racial tensions in the United States. The issue of Jews of color, especially how Jews of color have apparently been ignored institutionally within the framework of Jewish institutions, has become a significant matter. Now, the Pew, the 2021 survey that Pew just released, says that they did not ask, do you identify as a Jew of color? They did not ask that question. They use U.S. Census nomenclature, and 15% said of the Jews responding said that they were non-white, which means they could have been Black, brown, Hispanic, non-white Hispanic, and so on. They do break that down a little bit more. Interestingly enough, and I can't remember where I read it, I've been trying to rack my brain, but there's a statistic out there that as a matter of fact, 17% of Jews in the United States identify specifically as Jews of color. And again, I don't know where I've pulled that statistic out, but I'm pretty sure I stumbled upon it somewhere. I think that it merits our attention. I don't necessarily have an agenda right now of what we can do, but I think that as Jewish studies scholars, that is, we need to be paying attention and paying attention, I would say, as activist scholars, Jews are already in many ways in a one-down position in society, and I think that being a Jew of color adds certain dimensions to that that position that many white, supposedly white Jews are not necessarily ready to address or contend with. I'll just leave that there. It's a work in progress, I think, but we need to pay attention. On the second point, I don't know the answer to. If you make your observation solely on statistics, you could say that there are areas of convergence, areas of divergence between Canadian and American Jews. I don't think we should rely on statistics to come to some sort of general conclusion. On the other hand, we know ethnographically, we know from the literature that the Canadian Jewish experience is not a mirror image of the US Jewish experience, and vice versa. I'll give you a very specific example from my own research. I've done a fair amount of work in the area that on mass media and the Jewish experience in the United States. And if you look, for example, in the early 20th century, the role that the mass media played in both unifying and assimilating the Jewish population, especially in the urban centers in the US, that created a very distinct trend in US cultural, in US Jewish cultural evolution, which you don't really see in the same way in Canada. So the answer is a guarded yes and no. There is divergence. No, there isn't. Yes, there's convergence. No, there's not. I think that we can't make a blanket statement on all counts.
Thank you, Hernan, for your questions. The first one about expanding the study. So what I'm going for is thematic diversity, and I haven't quite achieved that yet. There's still a lot of work to be done among Orthodox institutions, within some sub-communities that are not represented very well in the scholarship or in the archival record. So Sephardic populations and so on. So I hesitate to put a number on when the oral history collection will end, but I haven't quite sort of achieved that kind of diversity I'm looking for. But then, as I said in the presentation, that there will be a final round of interviews later on when the pandemic seems to be winding down, although there are all kinds of questions on whether something like a WHO pronouncement that the pandemic is over will actually mean that the pandemic is over, not only in terms of epidemiology, but socially and so on. And then to your second question about historical parallels, yes, absolutely. I think this is something to be looked at, especially once those second interviews are conducted and people can look back at the broader impact of the crisis. So I do think we'll be in a better position to make those comparisons then. But I will say now, just drawing on some of the narratives that I've conducted so far, interviewees are reluctant to make these comparisons themselves, and so there is this question how much value there is for individuals to compare their experience of the pandemic to other major crisis points in Jewish history. I mean, people talk about drawing inspiration from, say, Holocaust survivors or their own family history, but so, people use these narratives of suffering or survival, these common tropes in Jewish history as frameworks to talk about their experience. So they places where they draw inspiration and so on. But whether the comparative potential of this moment to moments in the past, I think, will become clearer in the future.
Thanks, Josh. Valentina, you had a question?
Yeah, I also have a question for Josh. Expanding a little bit on what Hernan asked you about, like expanding the research. I was wondering if you interview, or if you're going to interview Hasidic people. I know there is a very small community in Toronto, and in general, I was wondering, because I'm doing field with the Hasidic women and Hasidic also men, and I live in Outremont. I was wondering if during the interview, some people you're talking with, they're telling you that they were resisting the health department regulation, they were not respecting it. If there is something like that that's coming out in the interview, because me doing field work, meaning that I don't just met a person and ask. I kind of sense also what's going on in the stores or in shuls, or what kind of celebration are taking place or not. So, and how, if you heard about this kind of non-compliance, how you think you will be able to talk about it, if you are going to talk about it? Because for me is a kind of an ethical concern, what I will be able to talk about, to which extent I will be able to bring actually their point of view of what's going on. Because from one side it's super interesting, because it's the Hasidic people I'm talking with, they bring another perspective, they have another, they resist to a certain extent. Not everybody, of course, it's very diverse inside the Hasidic community, but how would you deal with, if you have this kind of answer?
Right, thank you for your question. So the short answer to your question is, I don't have an answer, because I haven't conducted those interviews in the Hasidic community, not for lack of trying, which presents, perhaps as you've discovered in your own research, and certainly people doing any kind of field work in Hasidic communities, as I've done in other in other research projects, that there are barriers, of course, and I mean, one of the well, in my opinion, methodological touchstones of oral history is that, I mean, part of the process of sort of establishing shared authority and the creation of this historical document is honoring honoring people's permission to share their stories, right? And if they decide not to, then I don't see it as my role to persist, sort of play the role of the journalist to extract that narrative. So I have no sort of clear outline for how there's a very sort of structured way that I reach out to people, but in terms of following up and asking again and again, I do that 2-3 times, and then I quit, because if I suspect that in communities that have been less responsive to provincial mandates, more operating outside of quote unquote social or communal norms, are less reluctant, or more reluctant, less likely to to want to share those narratives, especially for research that is by its nature going to become part of the public record. These are narratives that will be available for people in the archives in the future.
Thanks, Josh. Okay. We have Bernard wants to have a brief comment. I just want to make sure, do we not have any more questions before we go for a comment? All right, Bernard, it's all you.
Thank you very much. My comment has to do with, oh, just a minute, there. My comment has to do with historical sizes of populations of Jews in Canada versus the United States. And this is related to my own research, which I hope to get back to after several years. In the 1881 census in Canada, there were fewer than 2,500 Jews in the country, fewer than 2,500 Jews. In the United States, by 1881, in their census, there were already 250,000 Jews. By the beginning of World War II, fully half of the Jews in the United States had been born in the United States. And this stark difference between the two populations, I think, is very, very significant in terms of differences between the Jewish population in Canada today and the American Jewish population. And we have to add to that, or I have to add to that comment, by saying that between 1920 and 1924, the restriction on immigration, not only of Jews, but from Eastern Europe generally, and I believe from Mediterranean countries as well, became more and more pronounced. So that by 1924, when the Johnson-Reed Act was passed by Congress, it pretty much closed the doors. That is not the case in Canada. In Canada, we continued to have Jews coming into the country up until, we all know none is too many, had a strong impact. But those, I think, are important differences because it means that the Jewish community of the United States was more intensely, if I can put it this way, Americanized than the Jewish community in Canada was Canadianized. So that's my comment, and I welcome any remarks from our three speakers today. Thank you.
Thanks, Bernard.
May I respond just briefly to that? I would agree on all counts. Thank you so much for your comment. I look forward to seeing the fruits of your research. And what you say is true. You know, by the end of the First World War, I think that there were somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 million Jews living in the New York City metropolitan region. And even I grew up in the Bronx. My childhood was in the I'll date myself now, late 50s and 60s. And even as a child growing up in the Bronx, there were still close to 3 million Jews in the metropolitan area. That's no longer the case. And yes, when I was talking about the role of mass media, there was tremendous pressure on the Jewish community to assimilate, to become Yankees. And you know, I'll just tell the anecdote that my father used to tell me about one of his grandfathers. There were 3 families living together in a brownstone on the Lower East Side that one of his grandfathers owned. This great grandfather of mine, his name was Gershon, but his street name was Harry. My father remembers growing up as a child that on the mantelpiece of the mantle of the fireplace in the home around Christmas time, there were always stockings hanging from the mantelpiece. Now, this was an observant Orthodox family, keeping kosher and all of that. And so I asked my dad, I said, you know, was there anything in the stockings? He says, no. I said, I think the stockings were empty. And I said, I don't even think he said, I don't think my grandfather even knew what it was about. He just knew that it was the Yankee thing to do, and that it had nothing to do with really a Christian observance in his mind. So anyhow, yes, as you're saying that, and that's just a sort of like a personal anecdote, but the push to become Americans it was very important, and the advertisers and the media outlets abetted that that Yankification.
Thanks, Jonathan. Are there any more questions? All right, if there are no more questions, oh, Bernard, you want to respond? Go for it.
Okay, thank you. Am I unmuted? Okay. Yes, I appreciate that response very, very much, Jonathan. And it just reminded me of something, your anecdote. For those of us who have seen the remarkable, wonderful film called Hester Street, the character that initially immigrates to the United States and later on brings his wife and child makes a point of saying his name is Jake, right? Not Yankel or whatever it was in the European context. And I think that from my own experience, speaking as a first generation Hiegegeborene Jew, I have many experiences personally, but also extending beyond that, the cultural Canadian Jewish context, the novels, the short stories, everything points to this really marked difference. While the general Canadian population is roughly 1/10 of the American population totally, this is really skewed quite differently when it comes to the Canadian population. Thank you.
Thanks, Bernard. All right, we have 5 minutes if anybody has any questions, but I'll just mention in 5 minutes, and this will go for every session, the 10 minutes following a session, we're opening up a couple of breakout rooms that you can choose to go into, where if you want to talk with somebody from the conference, you can meet up in this breakout room. Obviously, you're not forced to, but if that's something that you're interested in, enter one of these breakout rooms. You'll see them at the bottom. There's 4 squares and it says breakout rooms. I don't know if you can see them just yet because they aren't set up yet. But yeah, so that'll be available for 10 minutes if you want to go schmooze a bit. And then 5 minutes before the next session, which is at 1 o'clock, we'll bring you back in here and we'll have the next session. So if there aren't any more questions, which I'm not seeing anybody with a raised hand, I will leave you for the time being. You can enter a breakout room, you can have a chat. Our next session is at 1 o'clock p.m. And it is called Keeping Kosher. So I thought this was a phenomenal first session. I thank all our speakers and I thank all our questions and comments. I'm extremely happy with how it went, given that I'm the conference chair. This went even better than I expected. So thanks so much. And we'll see you back here at 1 o'clock.